talk about children today. I first went to Africa. One of the things that astonished me was the incredible inventiveness of preschool children. A helicopter mission arrived at the mission station we used as our base during that time, and within a week or so, dominantly little boys were making models of helicopters out of bits of wire, bits of banana tree. Some of them were really quite interesting. They obviously looked and took away quite accurate ideas of a helicopter. And yet later on, the whole educational system dies in the memorize and dump approach. They've taken the worst of Western education and turned it into what they call education. There's no malice in this, it's just the way it's done, because when you see something working, particularly educationally, the tendency is to see what you can do and then say that's what they did. But great teachers are not like that. My much beloved Miss Minnie, Wendell Berry's construction, described by him as Miss Minnie went to Teachers' College where she learnt many cunning techniques, which she never subsequently used, because Miss Minnie loved children and she loved books, and she taught by merely introducing the one to the other. Real teachers are compounded of two loves. That's why the Faculty of Education is a disaster, because you cannot teach that love. It's a gift. And so now we're seeing more and more parents becoming more and more aware of how badly wrong the secular system has gone, and then setting up their own schools, which is a good idea. But then they invite the people who wrecked the system in the first place to come and tell them how to do it, instead of looking more carefully at what could be done and how it could be done. Now, one of the things they could do, since I'm talking to a mainly Christian audience here, is that there's a very interesting thing about leadership in 1 Timothy 3. If you go down the list of requirements for leadership, there are no skills in the list. In other words, there's nothing in the list for leadership that can be taught in a didactic way. I used to think there was one, apt to teach, and then I realized the importance of the word apt, and Miss Minnie finally solved the problem. No, teaching is two loves. So now, bring this into the schools that are being set up by groups of concerned parents. Let's start looking at what is working well and what is not working so well. And what has made me think about this in the last couple of weeks or so is a particular book, which I'm now getting seriously near understanding. This is that gives everything. I think you get that on the screen, although for me it's all screwed up. Jonathan Haidt is, as far as I know, a Jewish guy who is very concerned with sociology and politics and that whole area. This book, The Anxious Generation, is primarily concerned with something that he noticed, which I think is going to be overstated for a little while, but it will get sorted out over time, and its tendency to overstatement will be reduced. I'm sure that you can actually get this on the screen because it's pretty simple. Now, you can look at that and note the shaded area is just after the introduction of the iPhone. And what we're looking at is the increase in anxiety, particularly in girls, since the introduction of the iPhone. What's going on? There's no doubt that we have a huge increase in anxiety. Any family practitioner will tell you that, particularly amongst girls. In boys, we have a different problem, also related to technology. They are going into virtual worlds more and more. So they're playing lots of video games, and they're not engaging. And if they're not careful, they'll reach a point where they can't ever catch up, but they're not even aware of that. The worst example is probably Japan, where boys are driven to get good grades, and then they can't take it anymore, and they go back to their bedroom and stay there for a year or two. It even has a name in Japanese, which I don't know. So we are facing a world where the education system is not working. When I went to school, we went to school and we had fun. There were no iPhones. We didn't even have lockers. We just hung our coat, if we had an extra coat, in the cloakroom and spent a day in school and then went home at the end of it. I didn't do any homework. I didn't write much down because I had a good memory, which most children do. And, of course, the medieval Christians, when they started thinking about education properly, realized that memory is the gift of the first 7 years of life or thereabouts. And it's astonishing. That's why they started education with the trivium. And the first step was to teach grammar. Everything that can be memorized. Children, as Chesterton said, they're so intrigued by the world that you can read a story to a small child and say, we've come into a room and there's a door. And it's just a door, excited by the idea of a door. Everything is exciting to them, and it sticks. What is important for us is, what do we make central to their learning? Now, we go back a long while to the best introduction to how it should be done. We go right back to the book of Deuteronomy. When finally, having allowed the Jews, the people that he created, to make terrible mistakes for thousands of years, and then he gave them another start, and eventually, when they were about to come into the promised land, they were given a commencement speech by Moses from God. And right at the heart of it, what the Jews call the Shema, is this: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength. And we tend to go immediately to, and your neighbour as yourself, because that's what Jesus says in the New Testament. But he's quoting Leviticus 19, not Deuteronomy 6. Deuteronomy 6 is much more interesting. These things shall be upon your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children when you rise up, when you lie down, when you sit at table dominantly, not in the synagogue. That's formal. It's the narrative that is taught to children inevitably. The only question is whether you think about how you're doing it. And the Jews were taught that it's Father's job to see that his children hear all the stories of the Old Testament before the age of 7 from his mouth. Now, the point about the stories in the Bible, the history of the Jews, is that it's the only honest history in the world. They tell it like it is, roughly 90% failure and 10% success in terms of relating to God in their kings. That's why Jewish children brought up with those stories know that the general tendency of the world is not to do what is right in the eyes of the Lord, but to do what is wrong in the eyes of the Lord. They come in with a very serious, if you like, prejudice, but it's a divine prejudice, that the fall, that human beings are not so much in the need of new laws, they're in need of more powerful wills. None of us have problems with knowing what we could do better in our lives. We all have bits of our lives which are, we know, out of order. And we try and do what we know to be right, and most of the time we fail, but not always. It requires work. But when you teach children early on, which I didn't do with my children as I should have done to the degree that I should have done it, but my parents did it for me, you give them basically a bank of references for all the moral problems they will meet during their lives, so that they can default to the story. So a child faced with a very difficult decision, God or the guy over there who could even put me in prison. If, as in my case, Daniel was the hero, the right thing to do is very clear immediately. If the whole issue is God, has been behind the Iron Curtain in China and other places. And the people who have done that come back with a narrative which is enriched if they come back. Often they don't. They get to go to heaven early, so to speak. Martyrdom is not a disaster, and it wasn't conceived of as a disaster by the early church. It would be to us. We're very wimpish compared to them. So the narrative, when it was biblical, is very powerful. And in the British working class, who stopped going to church in the early part of the 20th century, nevertheless, the people who ran the education system in those days didn't think the faculty of education was a good idea. They didn't have one. They thought teachers should know something about something. They should be a model of learning. That you should be in awe of people. I came across a lovely comment just recently, this week, actually, reading about Dr. Johnson. And the guy writing the book, Anthony Esselin, says, listening to him and reading, think, how did he learn all this? And he had a very hard life. He had no roof over his head more than once in his life, but he became perhaps the most potent intellectual leader who was also a good man. Anthony Esselin says, perhaps the best in the world. This is what he wrote. He was the most enlightened man of the Enlightenment, and nobody but Englishmen knew it. We will not see his like again. Our schools, our legislatures, and our entertainment will see to that. Those times allowed great men to emerge because they got the education by reading extensively of stuff that had passed the test of time. We're not doing that anymore. There's anger at great books. Remember, Western Civ Must Go was the chant at Stanford a few years ago, and now they've got rid of their library. And if you go to an English school, you'll have to read modern psychological novels that you would never read twice and not read the narratives that have been read forever, going back to the Greeks and coming all the way through to at least the early 1900s. They're not psychological. They're real stories. I mean, you would think that people in the English department would at least recognize the fact that Tolkien's book was loved by young people, is loved by young people, and it doesn't fit in their canon. Not because it doesn't deal with big questions. It does in narrative terms, and you could write endless essays on the subject. But us, no, we don't have anything like that going on. It wasn't too bad until the iPhone arrived, which is around, 2013 or something like that. Before the texting, you had to do 6 taps for one letter. It was very tedious. I once had to do it, and it took me about an hour to get the message I want and send it, but I've never done it again. It's the only text message I've ever sent in my life. I'll probably have to do some more in the near future. But once the iPhone came, they could do it all the while. And its impact has been huge. Now, I noticed long ago what was beginning to happen, in that students were recording lectures and then chattering to one another. Their assumption being, well, there won't be anything too demanding here. I'll just record it and then I can look at it later. That process is going on and on now. I came across some data not long ago where one school, I think it was in Florida, put everything online in a medical program. And then somebody had the rather strange idea of looking to see how much time the students are actually spending looking at that material. The answer was very little indeed, because once that information had been put online, they said, oh, stuff is online. It didn't take them long to find out that places like MIT, Chicago, Harvard, all sorts of places with really good teachers in some areas were putting their stuff online too. So why would they listen to somebody whose accent was so thick they could hardly understand it and didn't really have a deep grasp of the subject they were teaching when they could listen to the best in the world? This is the end of teaching in the university. You're going to have to be very good to get into the elite people who are allowed to teach, because people will listen to them. That will be the test. That's an astonishing realization. I mean, we're only just beginning to process this stuff. But the iPhone, its big difference was, of course, the instant back and forth that can go on. And so now the younger generation who grew up with an iPhone are utterly addicted to it. It is an addiction. And it is destroying us, destroying them primarily, which will destroy our society. Jonathan Haidt starts to look at this very thoughtfully. And one of the things he noticed is, it's reductive, of course. He doesn't call it reduction, but it is. Modern education wants outcomes that everybody can measure. So if you tick the box, you get your grade, and you can manipulate your grade because it's entirely based on the recall of information. Whereas in the past, before all this came along, good teachers knew there were people in their class who were extremely bright and very clever, and they would go a long way, and you didn't have to worry about it, because even if they didn't do most of the work at school, they could take the entrance exam at Oxford or Cambridge, and because it was rooted in the canon, which they had read and understood, it wouldn't matter that their grades at school, such as they were not the greatest. Tolkien, for instance, hardly went to school for the last year of high school. The masters knew where he was. It was the same school I went to a generation later. He was down the road in Barrow's coffee shop, teaching himself Icelandic, age 17. He became the first really professional philologist, history of language guy at Oxford. As you know, and real fans know, Elvish is a language that actually works. That kind of kid wouldn't get through school now. He'd drop out. The boys are dropping out because school is boring. School should not be boring. And the question is how you change that. Now, one of the things that Jonathan Haidt picks up on is it's isolating children, so they're not getting the social skills they used to get at school. And where does most interaction that teaches you've got to take your turn, it doesn't pay to be rude to everyone. Where do you learn that? In classroom or somewhere else? Well, of course, the answer is somewhere else. You learned in the playground. And now, schools in America apparently, on average, give 27 minutes a day to free play. Even people in high-security prisons are guaranteed 2 hours a day outside. Asked whether they could handle 27 minutes, they said the amount of violence in the prison would increase dramatically. They've taken that idea and studied it some more. So one of the main things, well, let's do the two main things. You obviously got the first one by now. Control of phones is very important. The second important thing is to increase play, because play is unstructured play, not people telling them, you play with this like this and these are the rules. No, the only adult's interference should be a watchful one to see that accidents don't happen. And for boys in particular, they must learn risk-taking along the way. So a hammer and some nails, age 7, people are going to hit their fingers. They're not going to die from that. In most cases, if they're really interested in what they're doing, they'll say something rude and they'll suck their thumb for a moment, then they'll go back to hammering the nails. Important things are happening. And they even collected some data showing that when they increase playtime, the number of references to the office for bad behaviour dropped dramatically. And there have been several studies showing this. So the first thing is how to get rid of phones. They really have to be got rid of. He suggests, and I think it's absolutely right, that you shouldn't have an iPhone until you're at least 16. You don't need one. It will stop you getting addicted to this stuff, and you will read books, which they are not doing anymore. And reading a book is very different from listening to an audio or watching a film, because when you're reading a book, you stop and you say, that's good, better read that paragraph again. Once you start doing that, you're on an entirely different cycle of learning. I'm astonished every time I'm lecturing somewhere and a bit of poetry drops into my mind. Well, then I'll use it. And people are astonished. A scientist does that sort of thing. I said, well, that's what education does for you. I mean, behind what I'm talking to you about at the moment is a paper that a talk I have to give this evening at the graduation for this year of Augustine. And basically, the bit of poetry that appears there is this one. Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. That's the opening. He's saying the world in which they're living, and he was writing this 100 years ago or thereabouts, is in trouble. And he ends thus, he says, the best lack all conviction, and the worst are full of passionate intensity. You're seeing this in the universities at the moment. Passionate intensity based on absolutely no knowledge whatsoever. I mean, queers for Palestine is the most stupid thing I could ever imagine anyone saying. I would love to put all those that are saying that in a plane and taking them to Gaza and see how long they'd survive in a culture that has the habit of pushing homosexuals off high buildings. No, they're ignorant. It's not about learning. It's some sort of need for virtue signalling, but it's a virtue without depth, which is the main problem that we face in our world at the moment. That's why the most important book one of the most important books of the last 50 years is, without any question, Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue, where he finishes thus. He says, at the end of the book, he says, if you followed my argument, you will see that I am proposing that we have already entered upon a second dark ages. But we should not be entirely without hope, because the last time this happened, good men and women withdrew from the shoring up of the Roman Imperium into the formation of communities within which they could keep the civilities and the virtues alive. This is what the homeschool movement needs to think about very deeply. It's the civilities and the virtues that have to be brought forward, especially the virtue implanted in them of the real value of understanding literature, he says. And they succeeded. The only difference is last time the barbarians were waiting at the gate, and this time they have been ruling us for quite some time. I mean, the political leaders around the world today are not impressive, by and large. They have no depth. This time, that's what we have. So our problem is what to do. Last time, they withdrew into the forming of communities within which they could keep the civilities alive. This time, we don't know what to do. We are waiting for a doubtless new St. Benedict. Benedict was the person who saw that the Roman world was going to fall apart, and he started the monastic movements. And within those monasteries, they kept the civilities and the virtues alive and the Christian story, and they were the beginnings of hospitals and care for people and sundry other things. It did fall apart when they had a very bad patch in the 1500s, late 1500s, when they had about 5 or 6 popes in a row who were totally worldly. But we've been blessed in the last century or so, at least. The Catholic Church has had 2 of the major minds that have influenced the Western world for good in John Paul II and Benedict. I'm no fan of Francis. If you are a serious believer and you don't understand Catholicism and you want to understand it better, you couldn't do better than reading John Paul II's encyclical, The Splendor of Truth, which is basically a Bible study. And it's a lovely work, and you get it for $1 or so in a Catholic bookshop because they want to sell it. It's a papal encyclical. But if you've got nominal Catholic friends, it's the best way to help them to either bring their faith to life in whatever way God chooses. I mean, there's a lot of traffic going between different denominations at the moment as people seriously dealing with the major questions are getting to work. So the first thing is to decide how we limit the iPhone. There are various rules they suggest, and what they've discovered from what they've done already, you can't just say you can't use your iPhone in school, because they will put it under a book and the teacher can't be watching everybody all the while, whatever. iPhones have to be locked away when they come to school. and they reclaim them later. There are various techniques to help you do this, but the school must be iPhone free. Parents will say we won't be able to talk to them if there's a shooting or whatever. And I mean, obviously, all the kids having iPhones when there's a shooting would lead to the chaos being greater, not less. Whereas if they knew something was happening, they'd be listening to what the teachers who would have phones would be telling them to do. No, I walked to school on day one to elementary school, about a 2-mile walk, without my mother, with the boy next door. He was 2 years older than me. I didn't want my mother taking me to school. So I went with the boy next door and did so every day. You couldn't do that now. My oldest daughter, when she came back from Africa, one of her children was running around the house and then playing in the street, which was a cul-de-sac. It wasn't dangerous. But she was reported by someone, and social workers came to see whether she was neglecting her parental duties. Because, of course, social workers want to write lists of parental duties. Parents are concerned about the thriving of their children. The things that we did with our children, which they all acknowledge were the best things that happened to them, would be anathema to the control freaks who run all these things. I mean, to allow a 17-year-old girl to run her own program in the middle of the Ituri forest and then come back across Africa on her own, what would a helicopter parent do with that idea? Well, my father allowing me to cycle all over the continent at age 14 and 15. The only requirement, send a postcard every day, which would get there in a day. The postal service worked. So iPhones out the way, and very swiftly there'll be more interaction in the class, so socially it will be better. Grades go up. Discipline is better. It really works. And increasing the playtime feeds into that, because now they start to talk to one another instead of at the moment when they have a break, they all go down and they sit and talk to one another, but on the phone. No interaction. Take that out and you begin to socialize. Those that have got 2 sharp tongues like me learn to control them a little bit. And so it goes on. So number 1, get rid of the iPhone. In the family, certainly they should be switched off for meal times. And a mealtime should be a time for serious conversation. And in our family, the meal of the day was Sunday lunch, which was a lot of work for Sally. Just once, she tried in the summer to fob us off with sandwiches, and it was the worst Sunday lunch that we ever had. I think everybody left the table, all the children, very upset. We never tried that experiment again. You've got to think of ways of making Sunday the best day of the week, not the worst. And that requires sincerity on the part of parents, as well as structures that help them to use the day well. My mother had a very, very wise thing. She said, on Sunday you can do what you like as long as you can take Jesus with you. For a child, that's wonderful. It allows any curiosity. I mean, there are things that I love doing on Sunday, which would be hard work for some people, but for me, they're pleasure. That's a relaxation, even worship. That's what it's meant to be like. So, number 1, the phone. Number 2, play. This is going to go against all the reflexes we've built up in society over the last little while. But some places are even having playgrounds in which they put all sorts of things that children can use their imagination with, basically safe junkyards. Do you think kids allow their imaginations to run riot when they're presented with all these things? Things like hay bales are great fun. And if you give them the big ones, then they can't lift them on their own, so they have to learn cooperation if they want to build something that's based on the hay bales. And there has to be someone watching to see that something inordinately dangerous doesn't happen. But minor cuts and bruises are acceptable. The atmosphere in the school improves. Playfulness must return instead of screenfulness, which is what we have. The boys just totally sucked in a virtual world and the girls sucked into a comparative world, unrealistic. They're playing games of adjusting their own images and then putting them on a screen and pretending they're them. And so other girls are just made to feel dreadful because totally unrealistic ideas of physical beauty are what they're pursuing, and it's a very bad idea. It's also a way in which sexuality is being perverted as well. So getting rid of the screens is in everybody's interest. Not going to be easy. And he says you almost certainly need to get a parental group together because I couldn't believe it when I found that children had to be met at the bus. I mean, as though they didn't know the way from the bus to their home because the world is supposed to be so dangerous they can't walk along the street. Whereas the data shows perfectly clearly that if you remove children from broken homes, i.e. where divorce is underway, abduction rates have not changed significantly in the last 50 years. It's not more dangerous. It's more dangerous for some children whose natural birthright of a mother and father who have promised to live together no matter what, particularly for the children. That's what's going wrong. Probably the best person to read on that at the moment because she was a lesbian feminist, and in the last year or two she's actually had her world turned upside down and is writing about it by having a child and finding that how angry she was that she very nearly missed out on this because of the propaganda she'd imbibed early on. That's Mary Harrington. You'll find her on Unheard and other places. You can watch the whole process because she was quite early on YouTube. You can find her still being a standard feminist, but now she's saying things they don't like. So get the book, start working on getting parents to read it with you. Aim first of all at getting the iPhone out of school totally, which means you've got to come up with some means of, they'll come to school with it, but it needs to be put somewhere safe, locked up until the end of the day or whatever, and then work on increasing playtime. And he suggests, I think rightly, that there should be at least two, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And he suggests having the morning one before lunch, because otherwise lunch dominates the whole thing, whereas if you have the playtime and then get lunch, they'll have lunch in 10 minutes and not waste it on the cafeteria. But you can read the book and go through it. But the material on anxiety and the virtual world, anxiety destroying the girls and the virtual world destroying the boys, is very frightening. He said he was planning to write a bigger book, but when and this would just be a section, but the moment he started looking into the data, and he says, I have 2 teenage boys, he said he realized he had to write this book first. So I think that's enough for today, don't you? I could add that a text somewhat related to this will be available from me if you want to write for it, because I'm giving it. Part of this will appear in a talk this evening.